Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, very glad to welcome you on behalf of the organizers of this conference and this roundtable debate to this session today. My name is Florian Bieber. I'm the director of the Center for Southeast European Studies and professor at the University of Graz. Today we have the opening of our two-day conference, which will begin tomorrow, devoted to changing society's dimensions of Europeanization. And I will tell a little bit more about that, but we'll first have some colleagues who will be speaking some words of introduction and welcome to all of you. And then afterwards, we will have a roundtable discussion today, which I will be introducing. So let me first invite a colleague, Professor Josef Smole, who is a deputy also to the Austrian Parliament. And he's speaking on behalf of the governor of the state of Styria, Hermann Schützenhöfer. Please, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure and an honor for me to extend a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the governor of Styria, Hermann Schützenhöfer. We really feel honored and we are proud that this conference is taking place in Styria and particularly in Graz, since Graz is the city of human rights. And I think the topic you are discussing is very closely related to human rights. At first, I would like to thank Professor Florian Bieber and his team for organizing this meeting. History and politics is a field of excellence in the University of Graz, in the Karl Franzens University. And we are really grateful that our scientists in this university organize this meeting and contribute so much to the development of this very important European region. When we consider what we are talking now about in this conference, so I have to admit that just a few months ago, I think none of us could have imagined what's going on in Europe now. We had 77 years in Europe where there was no complete peace in any country, but it was never the case that one country aggressively invaded a neighbor country as it is taking place now in Russia. You know, I belong to the generation who is born after the Second World War. But I still belong to a generation where the horror and the cruelty of Second World War and of the Nazi regime are not just a few pages in a history textbook, but there were lively narratives of my parents and my grandparents. And yet, I think nobody of us can imagine what people in Ukraine are suffering at the moment. And I have very deep feelings for people who suffer there, and I think it's European responsibility to do everything in our power to solve this war, to end this war, and to help the people in Ukraine. I also think about the Russian soldiers. Their ancestors have liberated our country from the Nazi dictatorship. And I think that most of the soldiers now fighting in Ukraine are just sent by a cruel leader into an incredible, cruel war. And we can also hope for all these people that this war will end. The sooner the better. I would like to thank all participants of the conference, particularly our high-ranking panelists and all people who are presenting. Once again, thank you very much, Florian Bieber. I hope you enjoy your stay in Graz as a whole, and particularly that you have a stimulating and lively meeting. All the best.
Thank you very much, and also thank you to the State of Styria for supporting this event. And next, I would like to invite Simon Kostenschnik, who is a city councillor of the city of Graz. Of course, the city of Graz is hosting us here today, and we're very happy and very glad to be in this historical location. So thank you, and the word is yours.
Dear discussants, dear viewers in the live stream. On behalf of our mayor, and thanks for the invitation, I also would like to excuse my colleague, Anna Robosch, who would have been here today and is in the program. She's sick, she got sick today, but she also wishes you a pleasant stay and a productive conference. The topic of your conference and today's roundtable is obviously as relevant as ever, especially in times like these when war is back in Europe. It's important to talk about international cooperation, peace, and our ideas for a more just, solidarity conference and a nice day here in the city of Graz. Thanks for the invitation and all the best.
Research and Career Development of the University of Graz, Joachim Reidel.
So, I'm not sure whether I'm more competent, but it's an honor for me actually to be invited by Dr. Bieber to stay in front of you and also to say greetings, warm greetings from our university side, as it is usually that some of the representative comes and provide some, well, get some impression, not impress, okay? So this is not the aim of this welcome. So I welcome all the speakers, all the discussion partners, and of course the audience from all over the world. And I think we're on stream, or yes, and of course all the participants which are welcome on a screen as well. There's the topic of the meeting, and especially of the discussion roundtable today, is all known to you, and there are burning questions, of course, to all of the society members, which are not experts actually. And the most important question, it looks like today in the news, is who to blame for this war. The answer seems easy. Everybody points to the Russian. Everybody points to President Putin. Who is to blame for the development that this war could take place? There is not so easy to answer. There we need to look back. There we need to ask the question, did the Cold War probably never ended, as we might all wished that the Cold War is open, but actually was it ever ended? Was this process ever came to an end? What I ask myself a lot these days is, why is it not able to us, or for our society, to transport values of democracy, which seem so simple, such as freedom or liberty, to the people in the world? But Bitcoin and things like that, they spread around very, very easily. So I'm pretty sure that a lot of these questions, if not such questions, even more sophisticated questions, will come up in a second or in a minute, and will be the roundtable discussion where we talk, or you talk, about the future of Europe in the light of this tragedy, which we all witness at the moment. So I will switch a little bit and will actually represent what is our system at the university to provide, or to hope to provide, excellent research. One strategy of our university is that we have field of excellence. And one of the field of excellence is actually represented today, and Dr. Bieber will say more about this. And field of excellence means for our university that we try to concentrate our infrastructure, concentrate our influence on, and concentrate the content of society-relevant questions into research, and the field of excellence we have, just to mention the 5 of them, are involved in climate change, are involved in biohealth, aging and all the related diseases, involved in smart regulation, where we want to try to understand how intelligence, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all these new techniques we heard will influence society and law. And we have complexity of life, which we call colibri, and last not least, we have the dimension of Eastern Europeization, which actually at the time of the developments in the last years actually is a problem not just for the east part of Europe, but for the whole Europe society. As it says in a family, if one family member has a problem, the whole family has a problem. And hopefully the whole family will sooner or later become the world family. So that would be the most easiest way probably to deal with things like we see today. Before I want to stop, I want to thank the organizers for this wonderful place to get. I want to thank the city of Graz that they have the opportunity to host us as a university, and in this case, this wonderful organization and the meeting we have. And I wish you all a pleasant weekend. As I saw, you have a very, very busy weekend in front of you, which is fantastic. I think that you sacrifice your time and you come here. And well, obviously, it's post-COVID enthusiasm now all over the place, and we will hope that we will carry that on at least through the year, but we will see how things develop. I thank you very much for your attention. All the best to you, and have an inspiring and fruitful discussion. Thank you.
So before we start with our panel, I'll just give you a little bit of background of what motivates this event today. Two important, you have all the banners here of different organizers involved. I should mention ARCUS, which is an alliance of European universities, which Graz is part of, together with institutions from Vilnius to Granada, across Leipzig, Bergen, Padua, and they are supporting joint efforts to research together. So a lot of the participants at the conference are from those partner universities, and the ARCUS network is supporting this event. We had planned to meet actually in November, which was the scheduled date of this first conference. Of course, not of this roundtable. We had a very different agenda on our mind. The fifth or sixth or how many COVID lockdown prevented us from actually having that event, so we moved it to May. So we're all very excited. We decided deliberately not to have an online meeting, although some of the participants will be joining us online tomorrow and on Sunday, but we said a good academic conference has to be in person. Everything online is just a substitute. It's a substitute, but it's not the real thing. Because as we know as academics, the really fruitful debates don't just happen on the panels, they happen over coffee, which you've already had, and they will happen in the reception, which you will have after this roundtable and in the coming days. And they're not just a drain on university resources, but I think they're intellectually probably often the very important part where ideas get born. As the Vice Rector has mentioned, the organizers of this workshop conference is the Field of Excellence Dimensions of Europeanization. It's a group of researchers, over 80, at the university from 5 faculties who found together around 3 years ago to work together critically on the question of Europeanization. And before I continue, I just want to pay tribute to a colleague and a friend who was the co-speaker of the Field of Excellence, Professor Karl Kaser, who passed away nearly exactly a month ago, and who was one of the key figures in developing this field, and of course in his extensive research on Southeastern Europe left an imprint not just at the University of Graz, but well beyond that. So it is this group of researchers who found together to work about what does Europe mean, but it's not about European integration or about European Union, but it's about thinking critically about Europe, the ideas of Europe, how within Europe and beyond institutions are exchanged, negotiated, and what do these concepts mean when we talk about European values, European institutions. We take them often for granted as something which is very clearly defined, but we find them shifting. In fact, to illustrate that to you, when we commissioned a cartoon for our original conference in November, we had an image of a curtain of the European flag opening up with refugees finding themselves stuck behind a barbed wire, not being able to enter the European Union, because we wanted to draw attention how many thousands of refugees are unable to enter Europe. How some were even brutally pushed back, if you are remembered, both in Croatia today or in Poland a few months ago. Now, we decided not to use this image today because the picture has changed. Europe, many European countries have been welcoming refugees from Ukraine. People who are coming here, and many of you have made this journey in the last months yourselves, and we're very grateful to be able to provide you a place to stay until you can go back, which hopefully will be soon, for the war hopefully will come to an end soon. But it shows you also what Europe means is very variant of closed borders and open borders, of being generous and being not so generous. So it is this critical debate we want to foster, rather than being a hooray club of Europe is great, but one which reflects critically on what it means. So this is very much the context of this event and our endeavor over the coming days, where we will be looking at a variety of topics: Europeanization and de-Europeanization, different themes of linguistic diversity, gender issues. So it's a broad plethora of topics we'll be looking at, which hopefully will inspire us for new projects and new cooperations. But at this point, I think I'm glad to transition gradually to our roundtable discussion, and I would like to invite our four speakers to join me here on the panel, and I will be very glad to introduce them, and then we can focus from the general introduction to the specific conversation, which I'm sure you're all very much looking forward to. So we thought nothing is more appropriate and more timely than to reflect on what the Russian aggression against Ukraine means for Europe. And there are many aspects we can discuss, and we hope to have in a dynamic conversation today about. So it is not a discussion about the origins or the war itself, but it's very much what the war means, both for ideas of Europe, for European integration, and the European Union more broadly. And we're very delighted to have really four excellent discussants who stood out, I think, in their public contributions in recent months, and of course well before that, their expertise on the topics which we think are highly relevant for our discussion. So let me introduce them. And so to my left is Olesya Khromeychuk, who is the director of the Ukrainian Institute in London. She is a historian and a writer. She's written extensively about history and memory culture in Ukraine. She's also been she wrote a book a few years ago called Lost, the Story of a Dead Soldier Told by a Sister, which is a personal reflection on the horrors of war, on the imprint on family. And so she will be speaking, and I think very glad that she could join us, because it's also reflecting on issues of how these debates are reflected both in Ukraine, but also how we have blind spots, and she's been very, I think, forceful and very articulate on that. I'm very glad to hear more about that. Then at the other end, we have Vedran Džihić, who is currently a senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. He's also the co-director for the Center for Advanced Studies in Rijeka. He's also a member of the Balkans and Europe Policy Advisory Group. He's an Austrian and a Bosnian researcher. He's a researcher who's reflected a lot about the position of the Western Balkans in Europe. We've been doing this together for many years. And he's also made very, I think, important contributions, interventions about how in the mental maps of Europeans, very often the Balkans are still forgotten. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Then we'll have Velina Tchakarova, who is the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, also based in Vienna. She's been working extensively on global security dimensions, and she's been creating a new fictional animal called the dragon bear. Here in Styria, there's something called the pantir, which is it's not a panther. It's an animal which has multiple animals combined into one of them. So we have a dragon bear, which of course means that Velina has been reflecting a lot on the cooperation and security convergence maybe of Russia and China. And so she's able to reflect on what this war means in the kind of larger global security landscape and how Europe can or should maybe find its place in it. And then finally, Fabian Zuleeg is joining us from Brussels. He's the chief executive of the European Policy Center, which is a leading think tank in Brussels. And so he's been working a lot with the many crises the EU has been confronting. He's been very busy during the Brexit talk, and so don't mention that word to him. I think we're all damaged by that. But he's somebody who will be able to tell us a lot more about what this means for the architecture of the European Union and its functioning. So these are some of the points. We'll have a discussion, but we'll open up to the floor roughly after 1 hour or so. I'm sure many of you have lots of questions to our panelists, so you're welcome to ask any of those questions. So, Olesya, but let me begin with you. So I would be curious to hear, did the war and way it's discussed in Europe, which kind of blind spots opened up, or kind of things which, maybe you did or became more visible in your view as an observer, as both a Ukrainian living in Europe, not in the EU anymore, but in Europe, and what kind of, how do you see this kind of, maybe both as a historian, but also as an observer, what is forgotten in these debates very often?
Oh, where do I begin? I suppose one of the main things I'd like to highlight is this sort of idea that, first of all, we're talking as if the war started 80 days ago, right? Well, it didn't. It started in 2014, and I will not stop repeating that because it's really important that we remember that it began 8 years ago, and that means a lot, and I'll come back to that in a second. But for 8 years or so, Ukrainians have been talking about this war, have been trying to raise awareness about it, have been talking about Russian aggression as an imperialist aggression, about the state of Crimea and occupied Donbass, and the kind of brutality of that occupation. And their voices were not necessarily listened to or heard. So often it was perceived as the kind of emotional Ukrainians speaking, and emotional somehow and rational don't go well together. You can't for some reason be emotional and rational at the same time. I think you can. I think if your cities are being bombed, then it's fully justified to be as emotional as you want to be. But still, a lot of experts were talking, especially in the run-up to the full-scale invasion, a lot of Ukrainian experts were saying, look, what we might expect in other parts of Ukraine if Russia occupies more territory is this, 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 and this. And they were basically describing Bucha and Irpin and Mariupol. But they were perceived as, not necessarily perceived as experts, but like, oh, of course, Ukrainians will be talking about it. So what I'm trying to say is I think there's been a kind of profound epistemic mistrust. Yeah, and I'm using this expression, I'm borrowing it from a discussion that we had with Vitaly Chernetsky, who's a Ukraine scholar based in North America, and I think it's a really useful concept for us to have. Epistemic mistrust, in other words, not taking seriously the voices, Ukraine experts and Ukrainians on the ground, and also what followed after when full-scale invasion began, suddenly Europeans, other Europeans, the rest of Europe woke up, realized that, that this is actually happening on a much larger scale, and began to seek out these voices, Ukrainian voices who will explain things. And I think some of that was epistemic exploitation afterwards. Quickly tell us everything we need to know, from Volodymyr the Great to Volodymyr Zelensky, and do it quickly, do it excessively, and also still what I understood in that process, that most of the narratives that were coming out, say, of journalists or even some of the scholars who should know better, were narratives that were planted by the Kremlin. The understanding of Ukraine as somehow something that used to be part of Russia. Conflating USSR and Russia to this day. I mean, journalists have asked me, when did Ukraine stop being part of Russia? Good journalists as well in London. And I would say, well, in 2017, when the Russian Empire collapsed, if that's what you mean. And clearly that's not what they meant. They meant 1991. So a lot of sort of ideas about Ukraine were the ideas that were propagated by the Kremlin, and then were adopted. And some of this, and that's why I want to emphasize the fact that it started in 2014, because it became a forgotten war. I know you want to discuss the kind of forgotten wars, but it became a forgotten war in 2014 very quickly, again, because the narratives about that war, the beginning of that war, were adopted from the narratives that were pushed on from the Kremlin. For instance, that this is civil war, that this is some kind of separatist fighting against Ukrainian armed forces. So the Western media, for instance, that is prides itself on being evidence-based and balanced, actually started to use the terminology such as separatists or Russian-backed rebels and so on, with no evidence of separatist movement actually being present in Donbass before Russia manufactured it, right? So the kind of terminology we used was the terminology that legitimized Putin's war, and it was, let's face it, it was convenient, it was economically convenient for us to use it here in Western Europe, because we didn't need to face the consequences that would have made our lives inconvenient. And I'm sure we'll be talking about it more in this discussion. It was useful to turn a blind eye to the fact that, well, not useful, but convenient, to turn a blind eye to the fact that Putin violated international law in 2014. And if we hadn't done it then, maybe we wouldn't have found ourselves in this situation now. I'm not sure if your question is very broad, and I'll be happy to hear other answers and perhaps come back with some more ideas.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe I would turn to Vedran, because it's in a certain way, Jürgen Habermas wrote this piece a few weeks ago where he said Europe has been in peace for 77 years. And I counted in the years, at least since 1989, there have been more years of war in Europe than of peace. Besides, of course, the war in Ukraine since 2014. There's Georgia, there's the Armenian-Azeri conflict, there is the two wars in Chechnya, there is, and of course, one can think of the wars in the Balkans. So is this in a certain way a systemic blind spot, or just the glitch of an aging German philosopher?
No, I mean, he's aging, but he's still influential. Yeah. But looking at the debate in the last few weeks, he's not the first one to claim basically that this is the biggest and the first war since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Obviously, when I, from my personal perspective, speaking about emotionality, but at the same time also rationality, looking into the war constellation of the 90s, I get angry at this moment, as many of my fellow citizens, Bosnians, get angry, but also people from Kosovo, Croatia, Slovenia, and all the others that you just mentioned. But the overall or bigger question is basically, why is that we have these blind spots, and what is producing that kind of a narrative? And I think a kind of a larger question is that the European consciousness, or however we approach that kind of a narrative, a long-term narrative of what Europe is, has blind spots, inclusions and exclusions of certain moments in the European history, which presents a problem for the presence of the European idea, whatever it is, and for the future. I mean, the same goes for refugees that you mentioned in your opening remarks. I mean, now we have this kind of a welcoming of Ukrainian refugees, which is very much needed, but at the same time, we discussed before the stance of the British government to the refugees from Ukraine, or the first structural racist tendencies coming up in Austria, Germany against the Ukrainian refugees, which again is a same mechanism of including, excluding certain parts of the European past and present. And I think if we want to construct or reconstruct the European idea following the war in Ukraine, which is going to be one of the biggest tasks of all of us, I think we have to create a deep understanding and consciousness of the diversity and different parts of the European memory, and that certainly includes the wars in the 90s. And it has also like practical meaning for the future of Europe. I mean, when we now look into the war in Ukraine, it's quite obvious that the population is suffering right now. We have all possible constellations, but it is also quite obvious that there will be, at some point in the future, a time when the war will come to an end. And when a war comes to an end, then big decisions are made. And looking now at Bosnia particularly, for example, and the way how the Bosnian war was ended with the Dayton Peace Agreement, we could have a kind of a word of caution when it comes to the Ukrainian post-war order, meaning what does a bad compromise or what a bad compromise could mean for the functionality of the Ukrainian state. What will be the type of the regional cooperation that we will need anyhow? I mean, even if you just imagine Russia beyond Putin or Belarus beyond Putin, but still the memories of the war and the remnants of the traumas will be here with us. So basically looking back at Dayton and the Bosnian constitution and the problems that developed after it will be quite important. And then in Bosnia, and the wars in the 90s in Yugoslavia taught us that the emotional landscape, besides the political landscape of the post-Ukrainian constellation, that the emotional landscape are going to be very tough and something where we will need to devote a lot of energy to overcome what is growing right now on all sides. It is hatred, it is the moments of revenge. It is something that you can get rid of within few weeks or few months. And now we can teach, we can learn a lot from the Bosnian case, and looking at Bosnia in 2022, and simply accepting the fact that the emotional landscapes of Bosnian war have not been resolved in a positive manner, and that we still have in 2022 people denying genocide, that we have politicians being able to instrumentalize the events of the 90s, and that we have a situation where even the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Bosnia and Herzegovina is put under question, is also another kind of a big word of caution when looking into Ukraine. I mean, my bigger argument is basically we need this kind of a deeper consciousness. We need to learn from previous constellations and put our forces together in order to shape what is to come, and that this is hopefully some kind of a revitalization of the European idea on new grounds.
Thanks, Vedran. I think like the point you made about also how the aftermath of the war, which will come hopefully sooner rather than later, but which will come at some point, is going to be very important both in Europe and in Ukraine. And I was thinking of Max Berkholz's wonderful book called "Violence is a Generative Force," which is a story of a micro story of a small town in Bosnia during the Second World War, and how the violence which occurred generated identities. I mean, violence reinforces particular types of national, local identities. I mean, because it is such a traumatic experience. And what that means, both for Ukraine as well as for larger Europe, is I think going to be very important. Because you want to jump in?
Can I
yes,
jump in
yes, go ahead.
Very quickly.
Yes.
I can't resist taken us slightly further back to 1945 and onwards. And you know, when we talk about forgotten wars and also blind spots, one thing I'd like to highlight is that, you know, Western Europe and Eastern Europe did a lot of work with its past. Often Western Europe looked with certain patronizing attitude towards Eastern Europe, memory wars, you know, not necessarily understanding the landscape, emotional landscape as well, and how difficult it was to process the trauma of the Second World War. But still, you know, work has been done. What I think hasn't been done on the memory of the Second World War is the work in Russia and of our attitude towards Russia as well. And this is also when USSR and Russia get conflated. So, you know, the Russians won on the Eastern Front and so on. And that's the kind of narratives that Putin tries to put forward. We all read or listened, I'm sure, to 9th of May non-victory speech that he delivered recently, and it was all kind of conflating past and present, but most importantly, talking about Russia as a victor and a victim of the Second World War. Yeah, an ally, victor, and victim of the Second World War. And Russia has never come to terms with the war crimes committed by the Red Army. The war crimes of mass rapes, of looting, of the kind of stuff we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment. There was never any reckoning at all, unlike in other parts of Europe. And I think the fact that Western Europe in particular, not so much Eastern Europe, I would say, accepted that narrative of Russia as a victor and a victim in the Second World War is very, very problematic. That's one of the blind spots. I think it's something to consider when we talk about the future. How is it going to be processed and narrated in the future? Will the Russian population as a whole accept the fact that war crimes are being committed in Ukraine at the moment? Because they don't, on a large scale, they do not accept it, or they justify it.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those kind of difficult questions of you know, how do you allow for ambiguity, right, of both the role of the Red Army to defeat Nazism in the Second World War, which is, of course, fundamentally important as a contribution.
With other allies.
Absolutely. But again, also that doesn't mean that there weren't war crimes committed. So it's this ambiguity which is often challenging. But let me ask you, Fabian. I mean, how much did you see in Brussels? You know, this kind of like, was there like a you know, the German word Zeitenwende, this recognition that this is a turning point? Do you feel it really materialized in the way this is talked about, or is it just, you know, are these blind spots, these kind of like things we've been talking about? Is there a reflection of that? How maybe from a European or European Union perspective, there's a large part of Europe which has not been maybe properly understood or thought about?
Thanks. It's always difficult to talk about the European Union when it comes to topics like that, because really we're talking still about a collection of different member states which have very different appreciations of history, of the kind of threats which are there. And I think it also has to be recognized that certain member states, because of their size, because of their political influence, have also been rather influential in determining how the European Union has seen Russia and the relationship and what should have happened after 2014 and didn't happen. But I think this time it is different. There is a real appreciation, at least among most people, that the true nature of Putin's Russia is different, that there is no way of creating a European integration process now which doesn't take into account that threat, which doesn't take into account security. So in that sense, it is a watershed moment. But it is also a moment of decision. It's a moment of crossroads. And I would say that moment will become very acute in maybe 3-6 months' time. At this moment in time, mostly what we're seeing is a reaction to what is happening. And that reaction, broadly speaking, we can talk about that in more detail, but broadly speaking, it is getting where it needs to be. The taboos which have been broken are enormous. Every day we're seeing more taboos falling, we're seeing more money also going into military equipment, weapons, which again is something which has never happened before. But I think the key question for Europe is not now. The key question is going to be, are we going to learn from this? What does this mean, not just for foreign and security policy? What does this mean for every policy of the European Union? What does it mean for migration? What does it mean for enlargement? What does it mean for industrial policy? What does it mean for energy policy? What does it mean for our geopolitical stance? What does it mean in terms of the cooperation between NATO and the EU? There is such an enormous amount of very difficult decisions which have to be taken now, which also will include looking at the decision-making processes in the European Union. We are just having, at this moment in time, a discussion where one member state is holding up action of the collective whole. And this is something which will have to be addressed. In future, we will have to have a decision-making process which ensures that one member state cannot take this kind of role, cannot hold the rest of the European Union to ransom. So I think this is an enormous change to what Europe is, not just the policies, not just the processes, but what is Europe about? Why are we having this integration process? And that will have to now include a real appreciation of what does that mean for countries like Ukraine. But when we talk about that, we also will have to address what does it mean for other countries in Europe which have the aspiration of being part of the European Union or not have the aspiration of being part of the European Union. So it is truly a watershed moment.
But let me follow up you as a German in Brussels, because I mean, of course, the debates in Germany. Sorry to put you on the spot there, but the debates in Germany, of course, have, you know, while the word Zeitenwende is a German word, in Germany one sometimes got the impression that Zeitenwende happened between February 24th and March 1st, and then there was a lot of silence and awkward, convoluted explanations, at least in the public sphere. Both the Chancellor as well as many, I mean, as I was alluding to Vedran earlier, public intellectuals hesitated in kind of making this leap of faith or this kind of jump to that there is, in fact, a new moment. Considering Germany is the biggest member of the European Union and certainly very important in terms of its, you know, if it actually makes that step. What is your take? Do you think Germany is able to, in a certain way, take that leap, or what is this? What do you attribute this holding back to? Is it just you know? I mean, because it's more than just Putin verstehe, or you know.
Okay, I'll try not to rant, but I think yes, there has been a debate in Germany, but I think also people have to understand that this is an enormous change for Germany. This is about breaking a number of taboos, also a number of taboos which Germany has been told for almost 80 years that it should never break. So there was an expectation in big parts of the population that essentially you could get by in a pacifist way, that you could influence economically, that interdependence would solve some of these issues. Not saying everyone who spoke out for Russia is believing that genuinely. I think there are also a number of people who conveniently believed that. It helped them to do what they wanted to do. There were also a number of people, and I think it has to be said openly, who were corrupt, who were simply paid for by Russia. And there were a number of people who were brainwashed. We had a lot of misinformation. A lot of money has gone into anti-democratic forces, which has helped to create that atmosphere. But in the end, I don't think that is actually a reflection of the German public as a whole. And there, I think, is also a real question about how this debate is being conducted in Germany. And that's the one thing where I would actually wish that the German government was more proactive, was actually better in communicating that this is not about economic interests. This is not about a discussion of how do we manage this interdependence within the European Union, which is a completely different question. This is a question of war and peace, where Germans are indirectly, thankfully, but indirectly we are combatants in this war. This is a war against liberal democracy. It's against all of us. It is not just against Ukraine, even though Ukraine has to take the brunt of what is happening at the moment. So this is our values, our interests, which have to be defended. And if we are then talking about historical and moral responsibility, if we recall the appeasement which happened before the Second World War broke out, I think that is the context in which we have to discuss this in Germany. And there I'm confident that the German population will also understand that this is a moment when we will have to make sacrifices, when we have to make changes to how we have seen the world up to now. But by and large, and yes, it has been too slow, it has been too painful, but we are getting there. I mean, when we're actually looking at the heavy weapons which are going now, when we're looking at the financial support which is there, when we're looking at the strengthening of NATO, when we're looking at military expenditure in Germany, I mean, there are many things where the taboos have already been broken. But to come back to what I said in the first intervention, I think the real question comes in 6 months' time. What are we going to do then? Are we going to talk about Ukraine's membership of the European Union? Are we going to talk about having common procurement of military equipment rather than wasting this money which has been promised now? Are we going to talk about a next step in European integration where we recognize that these problems cannot be solved anymore at an individual member state? That is the kind of moment we're at. And when it comes to the longer term questions, there it's not just Germany. It is in many member states where, at the moment at least, there's not the recognition yet that this will mean big changes to all of our policies, to all of our ways of thinking.
Velina, how do you see all of that reflected in the security architecture? I mean, what is Europe's, how we've seen Finland openly now supporting joining NATO, requesting to join NATO. Sweden might follow, and the whole. What does it mean for the security, larger structure of Europe? And of course, ironically speaking, from neutral Austria, which claims to be unaffected by any of those dynamics around it, apparently.
Yes. Well, let me start first with the fact that we Europeans needed a war, a really large-scale, full-scale war taking place in Europe in order to wake up to the realities that were in fact already ongoing over at least the last 2 decades. So this war has been in preparation by the Russian president, of course, and the political elite for at least the last 8 years. And the very fact that it was launched on February 24th, 2000. Thank you very much. Otherwise, I should have started shouting, which you obviously don't want to hear. But I'm obviously able to do. So, which of course means that first and foremost, the way the security architecture was in place following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War was, of course, detrimental to the Russian geoeconomic and geopolitical interests, first and foremost, and it was in this particular phase of the developments in Russia and around Russia globally that made it possible for the Russian president to take this decision. Now, obviously, nobody can really read the mindset of the Russian president, but let me take this risk and try to explain the complexity of this reality from a Russian point of view, also, I think, relevant for the future of our European security architecture. Now, the first thing that I argue, based on my observations from the last 15 years, dealing with the region, and before that also, of course, first, second Chechen War, obviously a full, scale approach, how to deal with the direct neighborhood. The first thing is that this war that was launched by Russia on the 24th of February, and I agree with my Ukrainian colleague, this is a prolongation. In reality, Ukraine was invaded already in 2014, is a threefold, but the very existence of the Ukrainian people are being denied by another state. So it is very important to understand that why this war was launched and what was the difference from 2014. So it's not because right now here in the West we are having this discussion, and it's about two options: peace or war. And of course, society in the West wants peace. Everyone wants peace. The experts also want to see peace. But from a Western point of view, it is a debate about war and peace, which is why a lot of people are actually rooting for a ceasefire, for peace talks whatsoever. From Russian point of view, it's not about peace and war. It's about either it's going to be a short war or it's going to be a long war. And then again, it's the Ukrainian perspective. And from a Ukrainian perspective, it's not about peace or war. It is about either to choose war or to choose complete subjugation. So it's very important to understand that. The second dimension of this war was, in fact, entailing us, Europe. So this was also a war that the Russian president launched on February 24th against us, against the whole European security architecture. He wants to impose a new one. He wants to rewrite the rules of our security architecture, just to go directly to your question. And he wants to establish a bigger geopolitical and geoeconomic construct at the heart of Europe. We are talking about the second largest country after Russia in Europe. So being positioned in Europe, he can actually build something much more relevant for this transitionary period of the international relations. He needs the territory, he does not need the people, we saw that. And he needs the territory in order to actually reflect on this ambitious union project that he has been pursuing with Belarus, with parts, and of course we saw actually it was meant to be the whole of Ukraine, if possible, and even if not, with larger parts of Ukraine, and then at some further stage, also, if necessary, with additional other parts around in the near abroad, like, for instance, Transnistria in Moldova, or the two republics in Georgia, and so on and so forth. And why not, if he is successful in this war, not thinking also in terms of the possibility that he, in fact, would consider also challenging the concept of NATO by, for instance, attacking one of the small NATO members, let's say, for instance, in the Baltics, in order to actually show that activating Article 5 maybe won't work. This is, of course, everything in terms of scenarios. Now, speaking of the third dimension, so in this second dimension, it is important to understand that war does not only entail military means. War entails also commodities. And in reality, the whole plan to actually, in fact, blockade vital commodities exports, let's say to third countries, this has been in the making. This was right at the beginning of this war, the real plan. Because given the fact that Russia is wet exporter, and this is just one example, we are talking not just about oil and gas, we are talking about important corn, wheat, maize, and so on, commodities that are existential to large parts of the world, Russia being one of these major exporters, and Ukraine being one of these major exporters. So you have obviously leverage how you actually can inflict pain. And that, of course, would mean socioeconomic repercussions in large parts of the world, and that, once again, will impose more or less pressure on political decision makers in the West to act. And then, of course, as I said, it is about, if successful, imposing a new architecture, new rules of the game. And in reality, and I'm going to the third dimension, which was completely overlooked in the West, why the war would start. In December, we did not have this kind of discussions at all. When the war will start is the systemic dimension. Now, Russia is obviously no longer going to be the superpower or this great power with great power projection in this emerging new global order. So here, of course, it's about other systemic rivals. It's about the United States and China, where the Russian president sees a valuable seat on the table as a kind of an indispensable actor. And given the fact that he considered himself being able to succeed with this war, this was in fact his thinking, as we saw, to go all in against such a country, which was also preparing over the last 8 years for a war, and to think that it's possible to subjugate it in like 1 or 2 weeks. So in reality, he also needed a war in order to position, to improve actually its own, Russia's position in this emerging systemic rivalry between China and United States. He is expecting that United States are going to withdraw from Europe at some point of time because they have to refocus on the Indo-Pacific. Then he thinks, okay, who would be this major actor, military power in Europe, given that the other European powers will be geopolitically irrelevant, if successful. And in a sense, what we overlooked is that the Russian president would have never started this war on February 24th if he had not relied on the overt, comprehensive support by China. And I would stop here because I suppose that there will be also questions and comments by the other colleagues.
Thanks. I think Fabian and so want to react. Fabian, go ahead.
Sure. I fully agree, but I just wanted to add another dimension to that, which I think is Putin's Russia's misapprehension that this was also a good moment to strike because of the weakness of liberal democracy, and that he saw that over the last decades, Europe has been going through, well, we've called it the perma-crisis, one crisis after the other, interrelated crisis which we have not dealt with very well. We have gone through internal divisions, we've gone through Brexit, and that's the only time I'm going to mention it. We've gone through the years of Trump. So I think there was an appreciation that this was the moment when the West was so weak that it wouldn't put up any kind of resistance, it wouldn't put up any kind of support. And I think he was wrong in that, in part also because the resistance which was put up by Ukraine was astonishing, and that also led to a reconsideration in the West. But I think in terms of his diagnosis, he's not wrong. I think that we did have this long-term decline in the power of the West and in the power of guaranteeing our security. And I think if we are not making the right choices now, then in the end he will still win, even though he might lose this war. But in the end, it is about, are we going to create a Europe and a transatlantic alliance, because I think those two clearly belong together, but are we going to create a Europe which is able to deal with these kind of crises in the kind of environment which we are going to live in? Or are we going to go back trying to hide behind the security umbrella of the Americans, trying to hide behind just focusing on economics rather than engaging with the geopolitics? And if we do that, in the end, we will lose.
Just a couple of comments, really, both to agree with Fabian and Velina, but just to add another sort of layer to this. Putin definitely relied on disunity in the West and in Europe in particular, and on inaction, because he's seen plenty of evidence of that inaction for 8 years, since 2014, right? So he was totally relying on it. And now it's true, now the reaction is completely different. There's quite a lot of unity, though Europe is not entirely united, as we all know. But I think for that turning point to actually turn faster, it is turning, right? But it's just extremely slow. I think there's one thing that we need to really, really understand, is that negotiations, as far as Russia is concerned, the only reason for negotiations with Ukraine or with third party over Ukraine, over Ukraine's head, is to divide the West again. to divide the West into those who will push Ukraine to accept some kind of deal and say, well, lose a bit of territory, you know, it doesn't matter as long as he stops. Finally, we need to wake up and understand he doesn't stop, you know, and into those who will say no, right, and support Ukraine, right? So that's the only purpose of negotiation. And I think for us, it's really, really important to understand that Putin is not interested in negotiation. He's not interested in peace. And this is where I really agree with you. He's interested in war. That is how he consolidated his power when he came to power, through wars. And that is how he continues to control, and not just his country, but his wealth. This is, it's a very pragmatic decision. If he controls his population from rising up, he creates a scenario where there's censorship, where there's severe repression, where there's absolutely no chance for opposition to exist, and they don't rise up, and I don't mean don't rise up in defense of Ukraine, because I've lost all hope that that's ever going to happen. I think there's enough support for this war, sadly. There's been enough years or decades of brainwashing for the population as a whole to support this war. But if they don't rise up against poverty, against their own hardship, then he's fine. You know, his wealth is protected. And for as long as he's at war, his wealth is protected if sanctions are slow, if sanctions are gradual, if sanctions are not enough, and if we keep funding this war that is convenient for him through oil and gas.
Thanks. I mean, this actually comes back to also Vedran's point, what you talked about, negotiating. I mean, there are times to negotiate peace and terms of peace negotiate, and there are other ones where you don't negotiate. And I think we've seen in Bosnia that a bad peace can be, having a long-term negative repercussion. But Vedran, I wanted to ask you about, this kind of issue of because there's like the evocation of a new geopolitical thinking in Europe, which is brought up forth, which I'm sympathetic with, but there's also I always worry that the geopolitical argument runs the risk of neglecting the liberal democratic argument, or that in a certain way people find shelter under the argument of we are on your side, but who are actually not who are not actually liberal democracies, right? That this us versus them creates incentives for being our bad guys, So how do you see that, or because I think in the Western Balkans we also have plenty of track records of those.
I mean that's an extremely important question. But let me just follow up on make two small remarks referring to you guys. I mean, first of all. And looking at the long war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, looking back and how the EU and how basically the world public adjusted to the amount of atrocities and to the length of the war, I think we have to be cautious and to be aware that business as usual comes quicker than you might expect it sometimes. I mean, we see it. When I just talk to my friends and to parents from my in kindergarten in the school of my two daughters, then I have a feeling that they have simply, in the meantime, forgotten that there is a war going on. I mean, they complain about gas prices going up, etc., energy prices, and this is something that we need to take into account. And I think this is something what Putin is taking into account and counting on that one. And the second one is, as you mentioned, the EU is slowly getting there. And that goes precisely to your question. Yes, I think in geopolitical terms, in terms of providing weapons, in terms of providing support, the EU is getting there. But at the same time, I'm not quite sure that the EU is getting there in terms of the political will and determination to have a strong focus on liberal democracy in Europe. And let me just explain it. That comes back to your question. I think the underlying issue that has been developing in the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years is this kind of a fight between competitive authoritarian regimes on one hand side emerging and popping up in the middle of Europe and liberal democracies on the other side. And the EU, and this is simply something that we have to state, the EU was not able to find a right way to deal with autocrats. With despots of war times, with those people that pretend to be democratic, but they are in the case undermining democracy and rule of law. Let's just look at Orban and Angela Merkel's take on him. Let's look at Alexander Vučić that has just won the elections a few weeks ago. And then think this kind of a pattern of appeasing petty autocrats or those that do pretend that they are democrats but they are not, that has become something structural on the side of the European Union to a certain extent. And now the big question is whether this is going to change now with the war in Ukraine or not. If we slip back into the momentum of trying to find compromises, which is now happening to a certain extent with Orban and with the question of sanctions, I fear that we might fall back into the stabilitocracy approach, and that we will, on a higher level, not be able to find a proper answer. And that brings me also to the question of the EU enlargement. And I think this is something that we need to discuss as we have applications of Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, and Georgia, and we have the Western Balkans in the line. I mean, the EU enlargement also over the course of the last 10 to 15 years has become a dead man walking technocratic exercise of the European Union, where basically we found this process of double pretending. The states in the Western Balkans pretending that they do reform, that they want to join, and the EU Commission pretending that there is a real process of enlargement. That was really a dead end street. And now comes the big question: what do we do now? We have Ukraine on the table. We have Macron's new proposal of the political union, and we have the question basically how to go about the EU enlargement in general, what to offer and what to put on the table. And I think this is going to be one of the most decisive moments in the months and years to come that are going to determine the European future. If the EU proves not to be able to have a strong offer, focusing on rule of law, values, not compromising those values, drawing red lines and creating that front against Russia, I think we might end up in what I stated at the beginning, in the business as usual, and that might even lead us to some kind of very different European Union that we don't want to have, that we don't want to imagine after the war in Ukraine.
Thanks. Fabian, I think you want to speak to that.
I think the risk that politics will try to go back to business as usual is great. And even hearing some of the comments in some of the highest political offices, where you hear behind closed doors that some people are talking about, well, broadly speaking, we'll go back to something which was there before the war. So I think that risk is definitely there. I think clearly the situation is different now, but often our leaders, our governments are not actually communicating that. They're not communicating that we are in a war. They are talking about that we can manage the economic impact of this, that it won't be that bad, that we don't have to make the sacrifices which come with that. If we have that kind of communication, it's not surprising that pupils or the general population don't see the gravity of the situation and what will have to be done, and that in any war, whether that's with economic sanctions, whether that is through the cost of living, there will have to be sacrifices which are made. And as long as we are not aware of that, as long as we are not communicating that, there will be that tendency back to business as usual. But I do want to also mention that I think the biggest challenge for Europe in terms of maintaining unity, in terms of dealing with this situation in the way it should be dealt with, is the cost of living crisis. Because this is much bigger in people's mind than what is happening in Ukraine. And if we're not going to address this, if we're not going to find ways of mitigating that. I'm not saying we can remove this completely, that the economics are very clear. We will have to deal with higher costs, higher energy prices. But we need to find ways of also showing solidarity between those countries which can absorb the costs and those countries which cannot, both within and outside the European Union. And if we don't do this, we will lose this war, because in the end, the population support is not going to be there. Now, on how we are moving forward here, I think there was a misapprehension in Europe. We had this picture of the European Union as an engine of peace. And the idea was that through economic interdependence, we create a situation, I mean, this is going back to the origins of the European Union, we create a situation where you cannot go to war with each other because you're too dependent on each other. And there was an assumption that that would also be enough to then, broadly speaking, bring the values of those in line with each other. And I think what the experience shows now is that it's the other way around. You need to have the common values to build the interdependence on, otherwise the whole system doesn't work. So we will have to rethink how the European Union works, we will have to rethink how enlargement works. And there, I think the question of Ukraine is, of course, the most immediate question, because we have it on the table, also because the European Union will have to play a role in the security architecture of what comes after this. But it is a bigger question. It is a bigger question about how do we reconcile the difficulties we've had in terms of differing values, in terms of also the internal resistance against further enlargement, which has led to this non-process where we are all pretending. And there, I think, I'm also critical of this idea of the political union, because I'm afraid that it might just be a way of saying no to Ukraine without wanting to say no. So if we do have a process like the political union, then it has to be clear, in my view, that for those countries which have the aspiration to be full members, there are countries which do not. The UK might well be stuck on an outer circle forever. But for those countries which have the aspiration of full membership, this has to be a process which can show a path to that membership in a realistic time frame, in a way which specifies what that country has to do, but also what the European Union has to do. Because in the end, many reasons why we haven't enlarged have to do with the lack of reform within the European Union, which has been politically too difficult. So it is a real reappraisal of the whole architecture of the European Union, which we have to go into. If not, what we will end up with, and I hope I'm wrong here, but if not, we will end up with a vague promise to Ukraine, with a general comment that yes, maybe enlargement is now something which is geostrategically important, and then nothing will happen.
Yes. Maybe we could say first and then, yeah, because I mean, actually also wanted to, you can comment on that, but I also want to kind of bring in this whole debate. Of course, if we go back to 2014 and the Maidan protests, you know, the European flag was very prominent. It was about European integration in a sort, or not membership yet, but getting closer to the European Union, which, you know, there are very few protests these days where people have the European flag as a centerpiece, right? So this is in fact, you know, and I think this was not appreciated in the EU itself, that in fact people go to the streets and it turned out risk their lives. They didn't think it maybe that they would, to get association with the European Union. I mean, you know, this is something which in the European Union we don't even think about as taking it for granted, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'll happily comment on that. I just wanted to say that I completely agree with you, Fabian, that it's about the way we communicate things to populations, especially politicians, the way they construct their messages, and the media, of course, too. And I am not sure if the cost of living crisis is more important, say, in Poland or in the Baltic states than the war in Ukraine. Those who know that they are next if Putin doesn't stop. And I think if we do communicate this, that if Putin isn't defeated in Ukraine, then we will have to defeat him much, much closer to West European countries, borders of West European countries, and that's going to test our security architecture even more. And I don't think that's being communicated at all. There seems to be this sort of moment of, like, you know, turning a blind eye and saying, well, it's happening, still this idea is happening somewhere far away, far enough for us not to be concerned, except parts of Europe are extremely concerned, and those are the parts that know that they have had to deal with Russia firsthand. In many different ways. And I think with business as usual as well, one of the most important things to do is to begin to stop it now. And one way to stop it now is to, for instance, record war crimes as much as possible, help Ukrainians record them as much as possible. Ukrainians are doing a great job already. Journalists are risking their lives, and there's huge teams of human rights lawyers that are recording these cases, which are numerous and growing, and begin prosecutions soon. Again, I think from previous experience, we're so used to thinking, well, it's going to take ages. It doesn't have to take ages. It doesn't have to take ages. Prosecutions can begin quicker, sooner, and we need to be ready to do that, to implement that, and we need to be ready to hold Russia accountable also in terms of reparations. And we also need to be ready to, invest in restoration of Europe. I'm really pleased that all of this discussion is talking about, when peace is restored in Ukraine, we look into the future, it's very hopeful. But I think in order to achieve that point, we need to work very, very hard now. Coming back to Maidan and 2014, and especially for someone who lives in London and, in Britain, I mean, not in London, London is very much pro-European, but in Britain, that was getting ready and wanted to exit, at least a significant part of the population decided to exit European Union. It was really moving to see how people understood the EU as standing for something really, really clear. It was all about values. It wasn't as much, I mean, I think people who were on the Maidan realized that, the actual association or actual membership of EU is still, a kind of long-term project, but it was about values, and these values were very much just the opposite of authoritarianism. It's the opposite of being, associated with the Russian police state. It's about freedom of speech. It's about freedom of assembly. It's about practicing democracy. Having political representation, having the opportunity to reform the state and build the state in which you want to live. And because on the Maidan so many people were killed by the riot police, peaceful protesters, and the consequences that we saw, Putin essentially losing it and grabbing Crimea and beginning occupation, I think people realize that price for those values, I think there's a lot of disillusionment with EU and structures and international structures in Ukraine at the moment, but the values are still there. And I think the idea of creating the country in which you want to live is very much still there. And I think if Western Europe in particular watched Ukraine and what was happening in Ukraine in 2014, not from Moscow, as was the case with many foreign correspondents, but from Kyiv and from other parts of Ukraine, they would have understood this sort of profound desire to change the country, and would have not been so shocked now at seeing this defiance. Yeah, there's a lot of shock and admiration, but shock, oh my God, Ukrainians lasted more than 3 days. But there's a very good reason for it. It's because, we have no choice. It's either complete loss of statehood and total subjugation, as one of you already said, or it's survival, and not just survival, but actually, keep fighting for the state that we've been creating over at least the last 8 years.
Yes, go ahead.
I want to make some remarks. First, I need to come to the rescue of geopolitics as a geopolitical expert, and I argue that actually liberalism and geopolitics / realpolitik are complementary. It's easy to be, to root for liberalism following the end of the Cold War, knowing that you are on the winning side and not having any real competitors challenging you in terms of hard power. It's very easy, to propagate values-based approach in such kind of environment. And I only want to remind you of our first common strategic document, the so-called European Security Strategy of 2003, which starts with the first paragraph pointing to the reality, namely to the security environment in Europe as per 2003. Never was Europe so free, so prosperous, so stable, and so secure. Think about it. This was only 20 years ago. If you look at our current strategic document, which was, by the way, adopted in March by the member states, it's basically the prolongation of the global strategy from 2016. And if you read the first paragraph, you will get frightened. It's not just about the aggression by Russia, it's about the rising geopolitical challenges, not just in Europe, but in the world, which Europe is faced with. And if I go back to the last 10, 15 years, just to give you one example, as an explanation why we are here where we are, it's a lot about self-inflicted pain. Because we, the geopolitical experts, were actually claiming we need diversification in all relevant strategic domains. It does not mean exit or complete withdrawal from Russia. On the opposite, we need diversified energy supplies, we need diversified raw materials, we need diversified supply chains, and we need diversified critical infrastructure. And in reality, if this had been the case, some member states started, like Poland, like the Baltics, which is why they were ready for what we've witnessed with, the imposed embargo of Russian gas supply, basically initiated by the Russian president. So a lot of member states were not ready because they simply neglected this reality, this geopolitical reality. Now, I argue that we need a complementary approach. When we talk about values, when we talk about our shared understanding, how we want to build up this community among us, among the member states, among the associated, among the candidates, these are all members of our European Union family, and it's about an inward values-based approach. It's about all of us, we all have this responsibility to build a community based on our shared understanding about values, about human rights, about the human dignity, about democracy, and about liberal economy. But the big difference is that 20, 30 years ago, we believed we can also export the values-based approach and turn the whole world into what we are. And this is not realistic. On the opposite, we ended up realizing that the group of democracies has been constantly shrinking. Now we have less democracies, we have a polarized world, we have a bifurcation of the global system where we were told it's not going to be about ideology anymore. No, it is about ideology. It is about, and this is what also the Ukrainian president claimed, it's a war between two worldviews. Or as the best-selling author Nassim Taleb claimed, it's a war between two systems. Which system is going to win? The one that is open, as it was mentioned, is actually in accordance with our understanding about values, how we want to build political order, economic order, and society, or is it about the authoritarian system? And if you look at the world, a lot of countries find the authoritarian system appealing. So once again, if Russian president is successful, it's going to be also appealing to a lot of African, Asian, and who knows where else, leaders. European, yes? Okay, then I want to stress something about the energy crisis. I mean, the energy crisis is important just to clarify for the sake of awareness. So the energy crisis, which was already ongoing last year, was not because of Russia. Russia triggered, Russia helped, Russia deepened the crisis in Europe, but this energy crisis is important for the sake of facts. This was a crisis, this was structural, and it was this kind of derived from the pandemic and the realities that once again we were not really diversified in terms of energy and energy resources, and then we could not buy the needed energy on the spot markets. But it's important also to understand that, of course, and this was one important indicator that we, the geopolitical experts, noticed. The very fact that the gas prices were skyrocketing, were surging, and our reserve capacities were at the lowest, or almost at the lowest, and Gazprom did not benefit from it, did not deliver additional volumes, was quite indicative of what was going on. Just to give you another idea. And finally, because it was mentioned about NATO, and then I'm stopping. Now, because there is this Russian narrative, it was the NATO expansion that basically provoked Russia to attack Ukraine. So I argue that Ukraine was in fact attacked not because it was pursuing NATO enlargement, but because it was not a NATO member. And if we follow the Russian narrative, now we should expect actually that Finland and Sweden should also get attacked by Russia based on the very same narrative that now they are pursuing NATO enlargement. I just want to be a little bit provocative because it's very important. We are an open system. A lot of different opinions are getting into the system, and we need to be civilized in fighting narratives, right? With facts, with logic, with facts, and with rational thinking.
Thanks. And I think, I mean, this links a lot to the link between liberal democracies and values and geopolitical, let's say, defense of those, links a lot to what Fabian called the perma crisis. The way in which the EU crisis over the last well, they're not EU crises, they're somewhat some global crisis since 2008, have given the sense that the European Union is only dealing with crisis management and not with any strategic thinking about its future, which of course is in a certain way you could say a tragedy. So many crises wasted because one always says a crisis is an opportunity, in the European Union instead has been kind of managing crisis, but not managing itself to become more, in a certain way, a stronger union as a result of those crises. So it was always a survival game from the global economic crisis to the Eurozone crisis to the, we can put a quotation marks, migration crisis, to the Brexit crisis, to the, Trump transatlantic crisis. And the EU has survived, and that's maybe an achievement, but it's not become stronger as a result. So in a certain way, is this now the crisis where the EU will not just survive, but actually become stronger, is in a certain way the question. So what's your take? And then I would maybe open up to the floor to the audience. Okay,
I can start. And I'm going to answer, we don't know. And that's the honest answer. You could say, on the one hand, the track record is not good. We have not managed to do that. Yes, we have survived. And we should also recall that when many of these different crises hit the European Union, there were many who said the European Union is going to disintegrate. And actually, in many ways, the European Union has been much stronger and has also been more effective in some areas than people had expected. But overall, I think this is also a reflection that we live in a different world now, and that what is required now is very different. And just there's danger that too much consensus is breaking out on the panel, but I think the idea, there's a German idea which was around for a long time, which is the wehrhafte Demokratie, a democracy which can defend itself. And I think this is where we have to get to with the European Union. But if we get to that, it means wholesale change across all of the areas of the Union. It means we have to take hard security very much seriously and look at it differently. We have to look at our vulnerabilities, whether you call it strategic autonomy or whatever term you want to use. We have to look at how do we decouple from dependence on particular states, not just Russia in terms of commodities and energy, but other states as well, in technology, for example, where we have very crucial vulnerabilities. We have to look at how do we defend democracy better? How do we deal with misinformation? How do we deal with the money which is spent by some global actors, both countries, but also individuals, who are out to destroy democracy? And we have not been very good at dealing with this. Sometimes when I talk about this, I feel like I'm talking about conspiracy theories because, and now I am going to mention it again, but when you look at, for example, Brexit, and you see some of the money flows which have gone into trying to influence public opinion to weaken the West, weaken the European Union, weaken liberal democracy. So we have to deal with all of that. We have to deal with a slightly dysfunctional European decision-making system, which was designed to allow member states a lot of space to say no, a lot of space to be able to integrate slowly, not to give up too much sovereignty along the way. And now we're being asked to go much faster, much further in many different areas, some of which are touching at the heart of national sovereignty. So there are questions now about whether we need, at least in some areas, a more federal Europe, whether we need a Europe where we can also make decisions which exclude a single member state. Maybe there has to be a way where also there is an exit mechanism, not because I think that any country wants to leave the European, but just to open the possibility that if you do not share the values, if you do not act in a way which helps the European Union as a whole, then there has to be a consequence at some point. And we have to deal with all these different crises, because the one thing about the perma-crisis is none of these things have gone away. They are all still there. In some cases, I mean, we've already talked about 2014 and how that has led into where we are now. But when we're looking at migration and refugees, when we're looking at the geopolitical situation, maybe in some of these areas it's not quite as acute as it was at the height of the crisis, but it will come back. So we have to actually find ways of dealing with that better, and that's why I was also talking about the cost of living crisis. I think this is another area where we're in danger of ignoring what the long-term political consequences of this are going to be. And I fully agree, in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, the perception is different. But if you look at, for example, France, the cost of living crisis played a much greater role in the presidential election. It's playing a much greater role now in the discussions for the National Assembly elections than Ukraine and the war which is going on there. So it is an enormous task. And in a way, where we are now is pretty much at the point where we were after the Second World War. We have to rebuild the architecture of Europe. And that is a very, very difficult thing, and I don't know whether we will succeed. But at least we should try.
Anybody else would like to come in?
Yeah?
Yeah.
I would say learn from Ukrainians. You know? Resilience is the only choice. There's no other choice. I think if EU doesn't survive, then what's the alternative? What's the alternative? I think we really need to ask ourselves that question now. And rather than commenting on EU as such, because I feel like I'm on the outside of EU, whichever way you look at it, whether I'm in London or as a Ukrainian, sadly, definitely, yeah. But what is Europe, right? And I think it's definitely now is definitely the moment, or long overdue moment, that we begin to think very carefully what we mean by Europe when we think about Europe, and maybe face up our demons here. Whether really Europe is as inclusive as we would like to believe that it is. I'll give you a couple of examples from my own sort of life of a scholar mostly. So there's lots of centers for Russian and East European studies, for instance, or Southeast European centers, or something else European centers. How many German and Western European centers have you encountered? Do you know any lecturers in Western European history? Because I know lecturers in Eastern European history. So there seems to be a separation into Europe and something else Europe, for instance, Eastern Europe. And to me, that separation feels very much like football and women's football. Yeah? It's like there's a norm and there's a curious addition to that norm. And I think this is the time for us to really wake up and realize that we can't continue having first-class, second-class Europe. If we claim to be inclusive, let's be so.
Thanks. I think that's I have to respond to that because I think on the director of Southeast European Center for you're exactly right, because of course when you say European studies, it usually is not those parts of Europe which are in European studies. So there's an assumption that Europe is indeed the EU, usually not even all of the EU, most of the EU, and I think these mental maps are still there, and I think this is, of course, something which we're struggling with. And I think it's not, it's not. These mental maps move much slower than the political institutional maps in many ways, but they create a blockage. They still put the brakes on in many ways, absolutely. So that's certainly, and I think how many people would have known before the war that Ukraine is geographically the second largest country in Europe, and population-wise,
a small country of 40 million.
Exactly. I mean, this is something which I think was I would bet with you 90% of EU citizens would have not known that.
But there's a way to overcome it. There's a way to shift our mental maps, which is relatively simple, and that's to give platforms, precisely, I suppose, what you're doing right now, is to give platforms to a variety of authoritative voices, and I don't claim to be one, but, to fund the existence and the development of these authoritative voices, right? To have a look, again, facing our demons, to have a look at, say, I don't know, in our university libraries, I'll speak of Ukraine now, but this will apply to so many different parts of Europe, I would say. Have a look at your Ukraine section in the library and see what's there. See if it's there. Okay, if it's there, great, wonderful. But then see what is there, who wrote those books, when they were published, and if it's on crisis in Ukraine, does it have any Ukrainian sources, for instance, because so many of them don't. And just begin to fund translations, to fund positions, to amplify those voices that will bring the knowledge, that this existential knowledge for Europe as a whole.
Can I add just one thing, because I think I fully agree, and I think the other part of that is also to make sure that when we're having these debates on the future of the European Union, that is an inclusive debate, and that actually also includes the candidate countries. It includes the countries which are geographically in Europe but not in the European Union, because very much we do have a problem of a bubble of particular countries coming together. And I think what has already been said in this debate, sometimes when I see the debate in countries like Germany, where Ukraine is kind of treated as an afterthought, where there is talk about what kind of peace deal Ukraine should accept without any Ukrainian voices being in that debate. I think this is something we can change. And I think I've seen it here, and I think there are some people in the room that bringing in also the voices from Ukraine directly, I think is a very, very good thing.
Vedran wants to, and then afterwards I'll open up to the floor.
Just 2 or 3 small remarks. I mean, what we have been seeing constantly on the European continent from in capitals of the European Union is a certain type of orientalization or Balkanization of the other outer circles of what Europe is. And I think in order to overcome that kind of momentum of minimizing the other while at the same time elevating ourselves to this kind of a picture of modern, most developed society, I think we have to, and also looking at the future of Ukraine, we have to do some homework. And now I have to come back to the Western Balkans, because Western Balkans precisely has been a place where this kind of stereotypes and narratives have been reproduced over and over in the last 2 or 3 decades, and they are still here. I mean, even nowadays, when you open like op-eds at New York Times, then you see the term Balkanization used, which is really dangerous. And what does it mean to do the homework? I mean, we have if we want to get the European act together, there is a certain job to be done right now, because this is the defining moment, and if we don't do this job now, we will not be able to do it in the Ukrainian case. And that job means looking at the Western Balkans, which is a small region encircled by the member states of the European Union. You have all the tools possible. You have military presence, you have EU enlargement tools, you have instruments of pre-accession assistance, you have the fact that this is 15-16 million population, out of them is probably 1/4 is already a member or has a citizenship of the European Union. And yet again, you please petty autocrats like Vučić, you host former Prime Minister of Macedonia as an asylum seeker in Budapest, Nikola Gruevski, and you don't manage basically to offer a kind of a broader vision and to take the people with you that are fighting for Europe or for emancipation of democracy, partly on the streets of Belgrade, in small villages of Bosnia, in small initiatives for, let's say, clean air or against river destruction, etc., etc. And this is my major point. I mean, do the homework, but then also go for the places and spots where you do have the energy. I mean, the European energy has been so much wasted also at the heart of the European Union through far-right forces during the Corona crisis, etc., etc. Where are the forces that you can create alliances with? And I think we have to look into them. And by the way, to end up on that note, I mean, we have to think about how to and what to do with Russia. On a longer term. So whatever we now, I mean, Russia is partly Europe. And in this broader vision, we have to see and explore whether there is any place for post-Putin Russia and those Russians that are pro-democratic and that have accepted those values to include them into this bigger European project. Otherwise, we will always have this adversary on the outer borders of the European Union.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to, for fairness, not just to bash Western Europe, but I think it's also high time that we actually deal with the Orbans of the world, that we deal with also the very difficult situation that, yes, Poland is in the front line of this, but Poland has done a lot to destroy European unity over the last years, has done a lot to undermine the mechanisms which are there, which the European Union relies on. And I think this is also a call to all countries in Europe that they recognize that this is an enormous scale of a problem we have to deal with, and we do not have the space, the political energy to deal with these challenges to the European system. This is also a contributor to us failing in what we need to do in the conflict with Russia.
I will just add some remarks based on my observations over the last 20 years, from enlargement processes to accession processes. And first thing that came to my mind when this question was raised was that because we are a peaceful project, I mean, the European Union and the enlargement and also the accession process, if you look at it, it's basically has been the only peaceful geoeconomic expansion where the European Union did not need to wage wars in order to incorporate other states. It was based on free will. But peace projects are not appealing. They're not sexy. I mean, if you look at what is going on right now in China, in terms of nationalism, how kindergarten children are being raised to love the Communist Party. I mean, if you look at these footages, it's so similar to what we had during the time of the Soviet Union, you know, growing up with this kind of feeling we against them. And it's sexy, it's appealing, they are buying into it. Then if you look at how now children in Russia are, you know, showing the symbols of war and are proudly playing with tanks. I mean, it's really cynical how actually society is buying into this, you know, war mode. And then again, what should we say? I mean, even how many kids in the kindergarten did you see with, you know, waving the European Union flag? And it's. It starts with the self-perception. We are just too critical of ourselves, which is also a good thing, you know, for the sake of debate, for the sake of, you know, democratic exchange. But I have the feeling we are just too critical of ourselves. We demand too much. We are preoccupied with our differences. Yes, we are different, and thank God for that, because it's the diversity that makes us stronger than this kind of, you know, strive to be unified around the one single flag of a one single leader and having this bottom-up approach. And then I was thinking about the successes of this enlargement process. As I said, this made the European Union, or turned the European Union into one of the most significant geoeconomic actors in the world. We are on par with China and United States because of that. and not because of hard power. Now, of course, the homework would be whether we want it, whether we want to learn the language of power. It's up to us, to our community, to decide whether we also want to defend our peace project, and actually, are we really ready to not just sustain some pain, as it was mentioned, but also fight for our values if they are being attacked. I mean, they are defensive force and they are offensive force, obviously. And just to give you one example, I mean, the very fact that in 2014, Ukraine was invaded not because of NATO. NATO was not on the table, but the prospect of incorporating Ukraine into the common market, this is what really bothered the Russian president. This was about the way how he saw that Russian geoeconomic interests were pushed away from Europe, that access to basically European markets were suddenly not there. And the very fact that he copy-pasted one-to-one the European Union as an institution and in fact launched the Eurasian Economic Union, trust me, I've looked at it, it's one-by-one copy-paste of regional integration. Means only one thing, that he was absolutely convinced that he would need this kind of, and this is the last sentence, he will need this regional integration project, similar the way we need it. Why? In our case, we are all too small to be relevant in this highly volatile world. But together with all our differences, not trying to unify the differences, but actually to explore the diversity and to identify the strength of the diversity, we have a chance for our story. And I argue there are other players in the world that do not want to be caught in this binary world, in this competition between United States and China. And we should also look for like-minded partners that want probably to go a third world, that are not probably able now to get involved in wars, because we don't have yet the hard power capabilities, but we can combine forces also with such allies and partners in the world.
Thank you. So now I would like to open the floor to questions from the audience. We have, I think, microphone to go around so that those viewers on live stream can actually hear. So I think there's a microphone there here, yeah. So if you just want to ask a question, maybe you can just identify yourself. So there are two questions here. Bilgin, and then in the back. So we'll collect a few questions.
Okay. Is it already on?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
thank you. Thank you. It's not really a question, a comment. It's so compelling when you're here to say Ukraine is the second largest country of Europe, but if you all agree on that, you also all agree that Turkey is not part of Europe, since Turkey is larger than the Ukraine. So when thinking, even with critical perspectives on what is and what is not Europe, it's really difficult and complicated, and we should probably keep in mind that it can get even more complicated than it already is. But thank you very much for your very interesting insights.
Thanks. And then there was a question just behind. I could just pass it back, yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me introduce myself. I'm Oля Denkovich. I'm Associate Professor of Criminal Law and Criminology Department at Ivan Franko National University of Lviv. I'm from Ukraine, and I have a question. Actually, probably I will shift the attention and like to try to draw the attention to the international standards of human rights. After the Second World War, Europe and Ukraine, as a part of Europe, consistently moved towards the elaboration and implementation of international standards of human rights. Russia also declared that it is a state that supports that those standards. Though the war in Ukraine and war crimes in Ukraine, especially in Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, Kharkiv, they questioned the efficiency of those mechanisms. So my question is, what went wrong? why those standards are not working. And maybe experts can propose or make proposals what should be changed in order to overlook the mechanism and to make international standards to be not only declarations, but practical instruments for protection of every human being in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who else would like to have, I think, a couple of more questions we can gather in this first round? Yes, back there in the back of the room, there's another question.
So, Vincent Heidinger, University of Graz, thank you very much for the very, very informative and broad discussion. And the issue was always, as I understood it, like, what is Europe? You asked it, what is Europe? And we had so many impressions of differences, of common grounds. But my question is, and this was also raised here, there are so many different nationalities within Europe, so many different countries. We have a lot of national crisis going on right now. So how can we then integrate those issues to come up with a common ground of values? Because I, as a young European supporter, don't see those common values. I see democratics shifting towards extremes. I see crisis coming up to livelihoods of European members. So my question would be, what are those values that could actually bring us together? Thank you.
Thanks. I think maybe we could have one more question and then go back to the panel. Who would like to? Okay.
Hello. I also thank for this very nice conversation and debate. I'm Robert Rydzewski. I'm a fellow researcher at the Center for Southeastern European Studies at the University of Graz. I'm wondering if the reason for ignoring the Russian aggression is perhaps orientalizing Eastern scholars who perhaps warn about the threat which was right there. Orientalizing, I mean exoticizing or perhaps patronizing scholars who are perceived as maybe not rational enough or maybe too emotional. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think we have, if there's no question in this round, we do one round of answers. I think we have had, let's say I take 4 questions. I mean, one is, of course, not a question, but an observation. But of course, Turkey as a country in Europe, and again, it raises the larger question of what is Europe and where is it, which also comes back to the issue, which I think we heard about. The same applies for Russia in a certain way, countries which are both European and not European, and how to make sure that this Europe is not. That it defends itself, but it's also not creating, kind of to avoid the exclusionary dynamics of Europe, which are equally problematic. The question of human rights, and I guess it's the question of, universality and implementation of those ideas beyond certain borders, which also echoes the question of values, as well as what are the European values within the community, which, and again, I mean, we talk about European values, and of course we have to be very careful, because are these European values or shouldn't they be global values? And they may be upheld in Europe in a particular format, but should we then say that they're not global values? Because I feel a bit worried when we say European values, because it suggests that they are geographically contiguous or geographically defined, and that worries me, because why should values be geographically based? There's nothing, we shouldn't fall into the risk of coming to the position where we believe that Europe has some kind of moral superiority to the rest of the world, which I think is the potential risk in such terms. And then, of course, the kind of question of I think, which also we've heard Olesya talk about earlier, this kind of not taking the voices actually from the areas seriously, which are the most affected. I mean, and I think we've seen this also as I think Vedran was alluding to in Bosnia and elsewhere. So who would like to go first with you can pick up any of those questions. Yes, Fabian.
Happy to. I mean, firstly, on Turkey, I think it wasn't mentioned, and I think that's an oversight, because the same question which we've applied to the Western Balkans, the same question we're applying to Ukraine, also applies to Turkey. What is the future of Turkey in Europe? How are we going to work together or not work together? Is it going to be a member state? How do we deal with values, democracy? So for me, I would go back to what I said before. I don't have the answers for all of this, but certainly this is a question which we will have to answer. And it also, we're already seeing that when you're talking to Turkish voices, who are now seeing that there might be a special treatment for Ukraine. There's a question now, why does that not apply to Turkey? Also because Turkey, of course, has been in the security architecture in a very different way for a very long time. On the question of what went wrong in terms of orientalizing the views, disregarding particular voices, I think that certainly is part of the answer, but I would make a more general point. I think a lot of things have gone wrong, sometimes for genuine reasons, sometimes also because people were influenced, but that's not really important at this point in time. I think at this point in time, we have to say, how are we going to do this right from now on? How are we going to put also the capacity into place? I think one of the areas where we have been incredibly weak is the question of proper, whatever you call it, foresight, proper strategic planning, looking ahead of what could the possible outcomes be. And of course, we need these different voices to do that. I mean, we have said in the context of the Burma crisis, we should hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And that's exactly what we haven't done. And I think that's something where we also have to address it. And I just wanted to also, not going to comment on the human rights bit, because I don't think I have a solution for it, unfortunately. I think we have a global system which is not based on a common way of enforcing these kind of human rights. That is terrible, but I don't see anything which can change that in the short term. But on the common values of different nationalities, different countries, I do want to be a little bit optimistic, uncharacteristically. And that is to say that with the European Union, we have achieved a remarkable thing. We've achieved a way of getting very different countries, very different nationalities, with very different views around the table. And for the first time in European history, these countries have managed to come to conclusions between them, without going to the battlefield, having decisions around a table, not around a gun. And that, I think, is something we can build on. It's not perfect. There are many things which have to be improved. We have made many mistakes. But the European Union is a unique experiment which has achieved something truly remarkable. And if we have any hope, it is building on that example.
Who else would like to jump in? Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. On the question of human rights, sadly, I'm no specialist and I can't offer any solutions, but I do think that this is a really important avenue where internationally practicing lawyers and human rights lawyers have to work really, really closely with Ukrainians and learn and readjust the system. And I think it is happening to some degree. We're beginning to see these cooperations, these collaborations, and acknowledgement of the fact that new tribunals have to be set up to respond to Russia's aggression and so on. So yeah, this is one of those examples where knowledge that exists in Ukraine is absolutely vital for our security outside of Ukraine as well. On the question of orientalizing dismissing voices, I've said a lot what was wrong. I also want to look at how it can be right, and what I want to see is, the change that's happening now. I mean, there is a shift. Let's admit it. There's a shift. There are fewer and fewer panels that don't have Ukraine specialists on them. Most of them still don't have in-house Ukraine specialists on them, for instance, if we talk about Ukraine, but they will usually have a Ukraine specialist on them if they're discussing Ukraine. The fewer and fewer discussions, at least I'm talking about, the environments I know, and Britain being one of them, which will talk about Ukraine without Ukraine, as it were, But I want to see this as not a situational moment, but a lasting change. I'd like to see institutional changes, cultural changes, building bridges with institutions in Ukraine, universities having really good programs, exchange programs, applying for funding together, collaborative projects and so on, something that will take us into the future together. And that's possible, and it's very much doable. And finally, on the question of what unites us, again, I want to give an example of Ukraine. So Russia's presented Ukraine as divided. The international media narratives picked it up, and we often saw the map of Ukraine. Thank you. The map of Ukraine as color-coded into two different colors, the pro-Russian and pro-European or something along those lines, or Ukrainian-speaking versus Russian-speaking, something like that. In reality, Ukraine is extremely diverse. There are huge differences of political opinion, of linguistic landscape. Remember, all of us are still bilingual, although that might change with generations, I think, and multilingual. There's such huge diversity of opinion, which has created tensions and chaotic political scene, right? But in times of crisis, everybody came together, and everybody came together around a very simple thought. And this might sound like quite pathos-filled idea, but it has a very practical meaning for Ukrainians: freedom. Its ability to not have to be repressed, subjugated, controlled, and so on. It's this idea of real freedom. What does it mean to actually feel free in your own country? And I do think that that's a value that is universal and is shared. And we should not dismiss it as overly romantic.
Yes, Vedran, go ahead.
Just on human rights, I teach human rights international relations in Vienna at the Academy of Fine Arts, and what we have been observing over the course of the last decade is this momentum of crying over the demise of human rights, both in the community dealing with human rights, but also among students. And I think with the war in Ukraine, we have reached this Gramscian moment of interregnum when it comes to the international world order, but when it comes also to human rights as a universal value. I think the old concepts, Security Council, human rights committees, procedures, European Court of Human Rights, where just Russia opted out or was dismissed. I mean, that has reached a certain level that we simply cannot move beyond that one. Yet again, the point is, and this is a kind of a larger point, we need to reinvent it. I mean, we need to ask ourselves, I mean, we haven't mentioned the future of the United Nations, of the Security Council, of all the instruments that we have created in 1945 that were not adjusted to the realities of the 90s, 2000s, etc., and moreover, that are not appropriate to address these global issues nowadays at all, and that has to include this universal notion of human rights, otherwise we give up. And a second question, a second remark on the values. I think values, obviously, Article 2, that's important in the process of enlargement, they need to be enshrined, that's important. But I think of something, a kind of a different concept that also has the ability to create a commonness or togetherness through acts, through daily acts, through, and this is the concept of solidarity. I think now what the war in Ukraine teaches us is that doing something on a solidary basis in a certain momentum gives birth to something new. And now, I mean, the European Union unity when it comes to sanctions, etc., and the big shifts that you mentioned, Fabian, in Germany, in Austria, etc., that's a birth of something new. And I think we have to count probably a bit more on the acts of solidarity and conducting them than on values, which is always tough. I mean, when it comes to values, because the others also claim that they have values that are stronger than the European values. And in the end, I mean, this kind of a solidarity act, but also the issue of human rights, that also calls for a certain type of imagination that points probably to something that Slavoj Žižek usually describes as real utopia. I mean, we have lost the utopian horizon for the development of European societies, and real utopia would mean, from my point of view, now that we have a war in Ukraine, to act solidary, to stand together, to try to draw lines, and then create preconditions for some kind of a new utopian version of a common, united, peaceful Europe that might emerge after the war in Ukraine. I mean, real utopia is always tricky because it includes the moment of failing, and you can always fail, but it includes also the moment of the real fight for that one, and that's what's left, basically.
Thanks.
Yes, my colleague addressed generously the question on human rights, so I will obviously refrain from giving an answer. Also, I'm not an expert, which is the more obvious reason. And also the question on scholars being orientalized was addressed by my other colleague. Now, I kind of smiled because I was going to say exactly the same about freedom as this really generic value that we all shared. And as a famous quote states, freedom is not given, freedom is taken. And in reality, this is what is happening right now. So freedom goes along responsibility to protect what we really share and what we have really achieved. So it's a daily base fight, so to say. And it's a constant adaptation. So of course we have all these problems, right? Nobody denies it, but we can address them. The very fact that we can express opinions and we can actually debate in a civilized manner is already a huge achievement. Now let me remind you that if you were now in Moscow and you would say in the public, this is a war that's going on, it would cost you 10 to 15 years just for the freedom to express an opinion, right? So I think that
fact more like
I mean, according to the Russian, I'm interpreting, right? So yes, so this must be at the core of this project, and it's going to be very painful process in a sense that we need to ask ourselves, what are we ready to take on as responsibilities to protect it? What are our limits? Are we going to stay in our bubble of convenience and, you know, we don't want to be bothered about anything in the world? Well, war is going to come to us. We may not want to use this, you know, famous Soviet narrative. We may not want to have war, but war wants us, right? So we should be really vigilant about it and agile. Now, when it comes to Turkey, I mean, from geopolitical point of view, Turkey has been on the rise in terms of its geopolitical ambitions, and Turkey's ambitions go beyond Europe and obviously are going beyond also the Middle East. So we should be aware of the fact that it's a different Turkey under a very different political leadership, that a Turkey that we can deal with if we are constructive, but it is a similar problem, and we should also be prepared for this to happen, that you cannot deal with an assertive regional power that seeks regional power projection in former territories of the Ottoman Empire, and quite successful, I would argue, by the way, which has a geopolitical rapprochement with Moscow, while actually being also more or less in charge right now for any kind of peaceful talks. I mean, in my view, these are not peaceful talks. This is simply a format for talks. But anyway, so what I mean is that it's going to be a similar scenario as we did with Russia. You cannot deal with Russia while not being prepared in terms of hard power. And I used to ask this question to stakeholders and institutional members in Brussels over the last 10 years. Where is your weapon on the table when you're sitting across Russia, and this is going to happen also with Turkey? What is your credible hard power projection if you want to be perceived as a serious security player, as a serious geopolitical player? And which is why, and I don't want to instigate any fear so whatsoever, I'm just trying that the very same neighborhood that we share with other regional players is going to be increasingly competed. And it's not going to be only Moscow's concept, there are going to be also different other external actors' concepts that will, of course, compete with ours.
Thank you. So it's, I think, time to wrap up our conversation we've had today. I would maybe evoke Vedran's metaphor of utopia. I mean, European integration was always wasn't a utopia from the beginning, right? It was a plan to do something which hadn't existed before, which was never imagined of what it would look like at the end, right? This was always open, and we don't know still what it would look like at the end. And maybe that's a good thing, that it's not that we don't know, because it gives us space for having certain ideas about the future. But it's also that, of course, you know, when a European politician says, from the European Union says, you know, the European Union is a peace project, it sounds like a very stale, you know, kind of record which you keep playing over and over. And that's because, of course, many European citizens who were in the founding members of the European Union stopped experiencing war as something which is unimaginable. Newer members have, of course, experienced war. Croatian citizens have experienced war, and others have experienced authoritarian or totalitarianism. But those who came from let's say, the 6 original members have not experienced this, and the generation who experienced World War II is getting very old, and few of them might be alive today, and so. It's this taken for granted, right? That in a certain way one doesn't have to fight for liberty. Liberty is something which just happens by birth and by being born in the right place for circumstances which are not under your control, and you take it for granted. And I think the war in Ukraine and the aggression forces us to rethink, to be reminded that this is something which we can't take for granted, and that, you know, while we might pretend that we can live as if it's happening automatically, it does require an active defense of it and an active effort. And the defense is not just a military, but it's also to defend it with arguments, with ideas, with visions. And, you know, whether we'll succeed, we don't know. And I think we'll have to try. I think this is what Fabian said, is like, it's an ongoing effort, and it's something which, you know, we don't know whether we will manage, but it's definitely worth trying. And so I'll end with that and thank all the panelists for their contributions and thoughts, and thank you all for joining us. Also those on the live stream, and those who are here in the room can join us, please, for a reception and a continued conversation. Those on the live stream, hopefully at some other occasion. Thank you all.